let's just talk about the NFT market for a moment. It's there's about 500 million invested in games the first half of this year. Many of those games have NFT components attached to them. We sort of knew that was a really killer app inside games anyway, these micropayments and buying products inside the games and then playing the game with improved opportunities. So that already existed, and I think NFTs just created a better, more solidified market for it. Do you guys see that continuing on in terms of games company funding?
Absolutely. I think that games have always been one of the most successful targets for crowdfunding, particularly if it's already a popular game that's looking to build an extension. I mean, on traditional crowdfunding platforms like Indiegogo and Kickstarter, some of these games have raised tens of millions of dollars, a few bucks at a time. So I definitely see NFTs, which not only give you the opportunity to invest in the game, but also get perks that are tangible assets within these games, is going to be a huge investment tool going forward. And I think the pandemic, if it did anything, it powered the games market. People are spending more time gaming than ever. So
So it's like project based finance or venture based finance?
I think both. I really think there are opportunities in both spaces. The games market is exploding, and it's becoming so much more than a pastime now. I mean, we've seen how games are being used to educate. We're seeing how games are used to help people pay their bills. That games are much more sophisticated and much richer than they once were as a market.
Yeah, I see it as a project based finance, and I feel that there's going to be innovation in gaming with the usage of NFTs, and not just the way that it's been applied so far. Clearly, as a source of revenue, what's happening in Philippines with people playing the game and kind of being able to sustain it as a source of revenue, it's going to last for a period of time. I don't think that's going to be the greatest the greatest gig on planet Earth as we go forward, since we've been talking about gig economy. But for a period of time, there will be an arbitrage in the way that you can play these games, earn revenue, and create sustainable living in a variety of places. Do you guys think that's not correct? That it maybe become a sustainable way of life for some countries?
I think it's hard to say. I I think that there's always going to be. I think there's more and more interest in paying people for attention, whether you're paying them for playing your game or whether you're paying them for access to their personal information. I think with the cookie apocalypse in the marketing game, um, there's going to be more and more opportunities to earn micropayments for reviews, for your opinions about things, and other ways that you spend time online. Whether it's going to be gaming or if it's going to be some completely new implementation, I think there's always going to be money to be made for that time and attention.
So, if you think of Stata paying people to view their programming, do you believe that's a sustainable business model? I mean, reviews, I get, organizing events, organizing viewing parties, getting more people to view something. I get all that, but do you think people will be getting paid to view something, and that's going to be a business model?
I think it's if it's just viewing, no. But I think if it's sharing data, even sharing preferences and affinities, I think we're seeing a lot of companies scrambling to create these first party data matrices right now. So the more information that can be gathered based on not just what people watch, but what they what other things they watch, and these relationships are going to be key in marketing going forward. And I think that sort of AI fodder is going to be worth more and more money as people get more adept at avoiding the more sort of brute force methods that this data had been gathered in the past.
Yeah, so I think we're working on an OTT company out of Europe that's ad supported because you can't really launch another subscription supported OTT business at this time. And when we look at the business model of expecting viewers just to show up, and because we have ad supported programming and therefore they don't have to pay for it, I just don't think that's not enough anymore as a core competency. And some of these business models that blockchain brings in as creating some sort of a different relationship between that viewer and the company, where the viewer is actually participating in the economy of that media distribution and aggregation process. I believe that's the future of media versus us expecting that now, because no one can pay for the fourth subscription for an OTT service, they're going to just be okay watching a bunch of ads thrown at them.
Yeah, I
So what do you
I think you're really right about that. And I think like what we saw with the Stoner Cats thing last week, and I know I keep talking about it, but I'm really interested in it, is the notion that, I mean, for a while, Hollywood's model was take something that was always successful and add a sequel or add an extension, right? But people are tiring of that. So I think what we're going to see now is that the fundraising process is going to be a way to not only gauge interest in a real sense, like it's one thing to say, oh, I'd go see that movie. It's another thing to say, I'm investing $10 because this movie has to exist, right? Those are two different levels of interest. And I think that content is going to be developed based on what people are willing to put their money where their mouth is as far as what they want. And that is going to be sort of an ultimate security system for content creators. They know people want it because they've paid for it. And oh, by the way, they've paid for it. So I think I think that's going to be a new way of working going forward. I think the studio system, the pandemic has accelerated a big problem that had already been brewing in the studio system for some time. So I think that this new approach is more likely to be the case. And I think it's also about moving away from demographics and moving towards psychographics and understanding that it's not just about how old you are and where you live and how much money you have. It's about what are you interested in and how can we build an interest profile that's really going to get the content people want where they want it.
I totally agree with you, and I feel that we're just at the very beginning of how media is going to be reshaped because of what's going on with this direct relationship with the consumer and the abilities that the blockchain space has given us, with distributed experiences as well as these ways of sort of compensating people to participate in these economies, that it's not even going to be, hey, you can just distribute your media and hope for the best in terms of a few guys in Hollywood kind of picking the topics and the subjects and the development budgets for top tier film and television programming. I think it's more than even just analyzing what consumers feedback is. It's going to be like a completely different marketing model and retention model for the viewers. And I think that's what blockchain's great.
Yeah, I agree. I have a question for Christian. I mean, I went back and watched your Infiom presentation on NFTs again. It was so good and there was so much great information in there. And I would love to hear your thoughts about how NFTs and blockchain are likely to relate to licensing in the future. This is something I'm really interested in but not really sure how it's going to play out. I wanted your thoughts.
Oh, how it's gonna relate to licensing. Yeah, I mean, in principle, it's a great tool for digital rights management, obviously, but the larger part here is that we still don't have a lot of the primitives that we really need to make this available. For example, I'm helping out one particular Skunkworks team right now to create an implementation for the onboarding of NFTs from Meatspace. So let's call it, there's a photographer and he wants to sell his art online. How can I make this as easy as possible for him not to have to learn a new language that talks about NFTs and so forth, but just talks about this is for you the first time a way of actually being able to sell direct and find your clients all over the world and not get rid of by just people copying it. But there is another angle to that that also needs to implement it because the PNG, let's call it, or the particular image, obviously is very hard to protect. Once it's digital, it's out there, someone is using it on their website, so it's really hard to not just have someone grab a screenshot or use his right mouse button and save that image and so forth. Larger point here being is you also need to then develop the enforcement tools like the copyscape tools that consistently crawl for these particular implementations and look if that right is not being abused. And this is what like the Gettys of the world do, right? They have 5 different law firms. They send out hundreds of letters every day and asking for $10,000 from people that just used Getty's images on their website. And so that part still needs to be developed. But then the other part to that is the current NFT standards, and it's mind-boggling that we haven't expanded on that. They're super simple still, right? They don't give you much. As in you're really just getting an entry on a blockchain and all the metadata that you want to collect. So in the case of a photo, for example, when was it taken, where was it taken, and who took it, that should already be standardized so that you can follow it back. And there's no standards for them within Ethereum, for example. So that someone hasn't done this yet is rather confusing to me because it's the obvious next step.
I wonder if
Rather,
it, I wonder if it could be married to something like IDER, which is a sort of metadata standard being developed in Hollywood.
I'm not familiar with that, but yeah,
Mm.
happy to look at that. But yeah,
Yeah,
my job is to find the people that were insightful enough to actually integrate with those standards, which is a constant complaint that I have, right? Because
yeah.
9 out of 10 times I see people developing technologies and they never checked whether or not what they're developing doesn't have a correlation in the real world. Aren't there already data exchange standards that are people using for their point of sale systems or for the ERP or whatever it is?
So do you think it's like a not invented here syndrome in this
It's
space?
it's hard to say. It seems more like laziness, as in I'm fine just dealing with digitally native assets, and I don't care whether or not the real world can be onboarded to my data exchange system.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Well, oh, go ahead,
go ahead.
Mariana.
No, I was going to say, first you got to create the decentralized sort of infrastructure, which we've been at it for a decade and more, and it's not quite there yet. And then you can kind of worry about onboarding what's out there, compatible or incompatible with standards and with each other onto that decentralized infrastructure. Because most of the world is not decentralized as we know it.
Yeah, and you also have to keep in mind we have a lot of legacy systems you need to be able to interface with. The standard example that I'm very familiar with is the travel space, right? If your data cannot be exported or converted in a way that you can reach this last little outpost which only has a telex machine. They have no internet connection. They only have this telex machine, and you need to spit out a certain format from your particular implementation that deals with, let's call it identity biometrics, whatever it is. And you cannot reach that particular data format. You have no idea it even exists. At this point in time, the entire space cannot make use of your solution. And there's just a general unawareness that these systems are out there and how they work. And it's always worth spending some time looking for that. But the other part, on the flip side, is there's 1,000,002 opportunities right now to onboard legacy physical things, specifically documents, into into an NFT form, let's call it that, for lack of better purpose, while actually paying attention to the existing standards, right? And that could be as simple as I'll create a simple app, and all it does, it takes a picture of my dry cleaning receipt, it recognizes all the items on there, and then from there I have a consistent and verifiable entry that was taken at a certain time by a certain person at a certain place. So if something ever happens with that good that I left there, and dry cleaning is just like the obvious example that everybody would know, but you can obviously think of 1,000,000 other ones, then at that point in time, this adds real value if and when it comes to a complaint, right? Because these things at the end of the day, what you always have to keep in mind, they're all contracts, right? We're calling them smart contracts, but they're all contracts. The smartness is, quote unquote, the way that they're being executed automatically. So the unstoppable code component. But the important part to realize about contracts is 99% of those require enforcement in the real world, as in, unless you provide me with the prerequisite so that allow me to reinforce my rights in the real world, then all of your smart contracts is not going to help you, because any judge, any lawyer will look at you and say, well, I really don't know what to do with your QR code here and how to get you your CryptoKitty. Come back when you have that paperwork that supports that claim, right?
Yeah, I agree. I don't think one can really even translate any contract into smart contracts easily these days. I was talking to a bunch of lawyers who are working with NFTs, and I was asking them, so how do you actually, create a contract for your artist that you want to attach to this NFT? And they say they take the contract they usually have, and then they dumb it down to like 2 or 3 lines so they can program it inside the smart contract. Well, that's not a sustainable solution. That's not going to work for most industries. This is not just the sale of art. We're going to be talking about, creation of a film project or a TV project, and there's a variety of contracts, and one will have to track. So the smart contracts can't do all that. Okay, we can also talk about DeFi. DeFi is under scrutiny again. There are all sorts of issues, with the SEC and with some of the laws that are being passed at the moment that could prevent further development of DeFi. Do you guys think that's an issue?
It is a huge perceptual issue. It's not a practical issue, right? It's just a huge perceptual issue, because the problem is always the same. It's always the same misguided statement, as in, we're going to regulate crypto, we're going to regulate blockchain, we're going to regulate stable coins. I hate these semantic lies with a passion, right? Because really what they're saying is, any regulator, I want to restrict the behavior of citizens that are under my purview. That's it. Obviously, every blockchain is global by nature, and every blockchain-derived asset is global by nature. And it is regulated. It's regulated by code, but not by regulators. Regulators don't regulate technologies. They regulate the behavior of people. And by saying that, they're just saying that we limit what you can do, and or we put these obligations on you that if you don't want to have them, well, the obvious thing is either you build the technology in a way that doesn't apply to you, which hopefully will still be possible in the United States, or just leave the United States and build the technology regardless of these obligations. So there's no winning in this case, right? This is all like utter nonsense to even talk about. But we watched the entire thing, and we actually watched part of it twice. So the one single person that this failed about, he is largely supported by the financial services industries. That's his main donor base, right? So he stood up and said, well, unless my nonsense bill, my nonsense amendment here for $50 billion to extend the military budget, unless this is being also deliberated, then I'm not gonna support even the discussion of this other amendment that would have pulled back some of the crypto regulation, quote unquote, that shouldn't obviously even have been attached to this bill, to this infrastructure bill, right? This is one of those low-level, low-life tricks that these guys keep doing to pass something that the population at large will simply ignore because they never thought that it would impact them, and they only find out years later that, oh, we should have been paying attention because this impacted us. I mean, it's very similar to what keeps happening with the Patriot Act, right? This was an impermanent measure that's silently being reapproved every year. And that's just a wholesale surveillance act of the entire population for no particular reason, and it doesn't make us safer. So it's the same thing. It's like we want to surveil everybody, and ideally we want to make this cheap for us. So the way we make this really cheap for us is we deputize by law all these players that are in the industries that are building technology. So, but on the flip side, though, ultimately it's not going to matter. So my point there being is we have deputized the banks, for example, to spy on all of our financial activity, even though if you look at the last 100 transactions done with your demand deposit account, you would see that none of those needed PII, none of those required that you disclose who you're sending it to or that you're sending it to him, because you were simply paying your mortgage or you were simply paying for your car or bought gas or whatever it is. So you could have done this with cash, but simply because we decided that we should deputize every commercial bank, this particular information was recorded with all your PII attached and shared 15 times until Sunday, and there's going to be a permanent record of this transaction. And not only does this add overhead that then finds its way in fees in your transactions that shouldn't exist in the first place, but also it should be unconstitutional. So my expectation is that it will eventually be unconstitutional simply by technology moving on to where you only attach PII to a transaction if and when and where that is required by an actual court order. So we're working locally here and informally with the cybersecurity division for Southern California. So they reached out to us because they're implementing these police body cameras, right? And it's a trivial thing now to do facial recognition with commercially available software. So anybody could basically use that same technology and misuse this as kind of a dating app, walking around at the beach and like just identifying people that they want to identify. Larger point there being is if and where you're doing this, you're actually breaking the law, right? And you need to be able to detect this behavior, and how do you do that? Anyway, so it was a long rant in terms of
No,
what regulation gets wrong with.
I have to say, Christian, this is a record that you made it 45 minutes into the call before you said utter nonsense. So
But I agree
Yeah,
with him. It's utter nonsense.
it's other
I
nonsense.
agree.
It's like,
I
it's like,
agree too. And
do-
one of the questions I had about that is, do you think that one of the things that is changing this is this idea of privacy as a feature, right? We're seeing that the phones are changing now so that not giving away all of your data is something that customers are seeing as desirable, and there's been a lot of pressure, sort of starting with Apple with the iPhone and then moving to the ultimately to the Android space, that customers are demanding
yeah.
this sort of privacy.
Well, it's much more than that. Let me give you a different data point. So, in
Mm-hmm.
in the developed nations and free countries, there's interested parties that collect digital data in order to profile you, right? So they're creating a
Right.
profile of you, and a profile has data that's a data collection of what you call a persona. So persona is the
Right.
data that you control, and then
Hmm.
profile is the surrounding data you don't have access to, but
Sure.
the entities providing these platforms do. And so the result might be that they socially engineer you into looking at something, buying at something, or not doing something, whatever it is. But here is another person, a dissident in the Middle East who is just trying to get his or her hand on certain information that the government doesn't want them to have.
Hmm.
And or this particular person or entity is unable to interact with the local fiat system because that behavior is being tracked. Point here being is our bar for viable technologies, viable digital technologies is if it can't serve a dissident in one of those oppressive regimes, it shouldn't be used by anybody. It should be a technology that's utterly invisible to surveillance on all levels. And that's what we're helping specifically one NGO develop right now. So right now it's just at a state where it's a guidance paper for these individuals to how they should be acting online, how they should be receiving funds and so forth to be safe. And then the next stage is that we reach out to community and either alter the existing applications that they already built or specifically build applications for that use case. But the larger point is everybody should be using that, right? So everybody should be safe in their own person at all times. As far as I'm concerned, all my digital dust that I'm creating on a daily basis or that I created over the last 3 decades online, that's mine, right? And by default, my default state is I opt out of that collection. You can't have it. If I have if I have ownership over that data, then any copy is invalid. Any usage of any copy of that particular piece of information could be as simple as my current location where I am. Every usage of that should be unlawful, right? Unless there's a court order that says, yeah, you can record that and you can share that, that shouldn't be possible, right?
I agree
Yes.
with you, but oh, go ahead, Mariana.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, in terms of, the ultimate vision for this is that at the end of the day, people should be able to, manage their own data. But the thing about that I always come to is, are they actually able and capable of
Yeah.
doing that?
I would move away from the data part because that's a little bit of a fallacy to focus on data. Also, like these statements of data is the new oil and whatnot. Data by itself doesn't have any value, right? It only starts to have value if where I start collecting a certain stack of that I can then use to make something happen in the real world. And that something happen could be just me putting my eyeballs on something or me doing something, right? So the larger point here is it's always about agency, as in, do I have control over my own attention at any given point in time? Do I have control over my own action at any given point in time? Because currently, everybody at all times is being social engineered into doing something. As soon as you go online, as soon as you put one letter into the Google search engine, if you put an A right now, you get a particular result. That is not something that you set. It's something that the search engine sets to put you at the top of the funnel to eventually get you to do something very specific that's based on whoever is the paying client. So that's the paradigm we need to change. It's the topology of the network itself. So right now, the network treats you like an oracle, something that spews off data that the network collects, copies, distributes, and then pushes something back onto you that has whatever objective that the individual or entity has that bought this particular piece of data set at that point in time, not what you wanted to do, right? So we need to reverse this in the sense that all of your data is essentially local under your control and you set the directive. So if you should be able to say that, hey, if no one is claiming responsibility for a certain piece of information, as in no one that can be held liable at the end of the day if this piece of information turns out to be, let's call it harmful or at least inaccurate. You should be able to just say and check a box and say, well, don't show me anything where there's no clear attribution. I don't want to see that, right? That doesn't interest me, but you can't do that.
No,
You,
I agree that that makes a lot of sense. But what I wonder is, we have trained consumers to expect things to be free or nearly free, and we have trained them to trade their data for that, whether it's watching an ad, and the more precise that data is, the more valuable their attention is, and the less they have to pay for the product or service. And so customers are so price focused in so many situations. I wonder how we're going to manage that process of
it's
getting them
Well,
unaddicted.
it's actually pretty easy, to be honest, once you understand the principle. So, I mean, again, it comes down to no one is really paying for the data, but what the data gives you, right? As in, by having a certain set of data, I can predict with some certainty what you're going to do, and or I can even use it to manipulate to do something. So, it's the typical part of the what we call the attention economy. But at the same point in time, obviously, that's wasting a lot of your time, right? Because your attention is being directed in 15 different ways that don't necessarily end up in a way that you thought it would. As in, hey, I just want one particular answer to one particular question, but I can't just punch in the question into Google and get the answer. Instead, I get 100 useless ads that try to make me believe that my answer is to be found in certain web pages that I end up finding out, okay, this is all just computer generated text and or text that was created by some labor camp in a third world country that's spewing out 1 million pages a day just to answer these type of long tail queries. But the more important part to realize is we all have a knowledge graph, right? And it's very different from how content is being presented to us today. Right now, the most popular content is kind of the one that's being presented to you. You need to apply, and that's again, this is actually relatively easy, that you need to apply is the one that's more closely resembling your knowledge graph. And that's what we need to focus on. That's something we mapped out over a decade ago, and it's actually fairly obvious, and it's also was actually part of the original plan of Backrub, which later was renamed to Google. So it was actually kind of the idea that we want to reference other sources, and these references, kind of the book, the references in a book, will add to the credibility of the statement that I'm reading. But this has never happened. This doesn't exist. Larger point there is, if when where we have these type of filters, let's say you have my filter, right, on how I look at web pages, for example, you would get a very different result than what you're getting now. And I would argue it's a better result, but better is very obviously very subjective. The more important part is to realize that we have all these overlapping knowledge graphs, right? Where that's what we should be making use of. As in, okay, if 10,000 dentists found this particular article correct and useful, then the 10,001 dentists should be able to use that particular filter. But that's not what we're doing at the moment. That's not how we're distributing information. And that was the original idea of the web, right? So when Tim Berners-Lee originally developed HTML, the idea was, okay, I want to make sure that people at CERN don't duplicate their efforts and are aware that these other researchers out of, at the time, 15,000 researchers know that this other research is being done, and or that certain things have already been disproven as to not work, so that they don't go down the same rabbit hole. But instead, we are doing exactly the opposite. We're sending people down rabbit holes to make them now believe more and more that the world is flat. If you want to get your belief reaffirmed, the world is flat, you can readily find this online and keep that belief.
Yeah, it's very interesting how this has developed. I remember we worked with a well when I was at KPMG. We sold the well to the Salon pre-IPO. And the well's addresses were the original ARPANET addresses, right? People who started the whole process of creating the internet. And they created the well so they can easily communicate with each other to extend human knowledge. But you're right. Today, if you look at the social dilemma, you realize that we've literally gone to the other end of that spectrum in terms of how we treat human knowledge online. And so decentralization, you believe, would bring us back to that sort of human knowledge centric development of the network.
Exactly, and that's the most important part to understand, right? So humans are the nodes of the network. Layer 0, right? We are the ultimate nodes. So we need to realize and reclaim that status, because right now, from the network's perspective, we are just another data source. That is literally dehumanizing. It is utterly absurd that we ever allowed that to happen.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. This has been one of the most insightful discussions. Thanks to you, and kind of putting everything in another wonderful coordinate system for us, and Jeanette asking very insightful questions. So I want to thank everyone today for participating. Thank you for your time, and thank you to the speakers for again teaching all of us a lot of important things, how to think about the space and where to take it going forward. So hope to see you guys next week, same time, 1:30 p.m. after the Salon. And in addition to discussing overall concepts, we will also discuss articles from our newsletters, as we always do, and also we'll have Q&A to the presenters in the Salon. So hope you can join us. Thanks, everyone.
Talk to you then.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you. Thank you very much.